joining us today for the launch of the International Energy Agency's new Southeast Asia Energy Outlook 2026. This is the 7th edition of this special report, and it comes at a particularly critical juncture for the region. I'm Jethro Mullen, head of the IEA's communications team, and I'm joined today by IEA Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol, by our Chief Energy Economist, Tim Gould, who oversaw the new report, which I note is freely available to read on the IEA website. And we're also very pleased to have joining us from Singapore, Suern Tan, the head of the IEA Regional Cooperation Center in Southeast Asia. So, during today's event, Dr. Birol will make some opening remarks, and then Tim and Suern will present the key findings of the report. We'll then take questions from journalists. For the journalists taking part in this event, we invite you to send your questions via the Q&A function in the Zoom. You can do this at any point during the presentation, and we'll also take a 2-minute break right after the presentation for you to enter your questions. With that, I'll hand over to our Executive Director, Dr. Birol.
Thank you very much, Jethro. Greetings to all the colleagues from IEA headquarters in Paris. Dear colleagues, we are here today to talk to you, to share some of the findings about our Southeast Asia energy outlook. I guess, I hope you all know that each year we publish World Energy Outlook, the most closely watched energy publication in the world. But in addition to that, we have some regional outlooks we publish from time to time. And this Southeast Asia Energy Outlook is the 7th edition. It's the 7th time we are publishing this. It is the among all the regions we publish dedicated outlooks, it is the one we made the most editions. Why it is like that? Why we put a lot of emphasis on Southeast Asia? The very reason is the region's potential, economic potential, the energy dynamics of this very region is generally overlooked. And when we look at the numbers, and we will share some of those numbers with you, I hope we can convince you that this region is one of the regions in the world that will going to shape the global energy landscape in the next years to come. Perhaps to start with, I share with you one number coming from this very report, the share of this very region in the global energy demand growth in the next 10 years is about 20%. So 20% global energy demand growth comes from this very region. This is the second only to India. So it is the reason we thought to make this report, and I think it cannot be timelier the day that today we are publishing this report, because the crisis as a result of the war in Middle East is affecting this region, and perhaps it is one of the most exposed regions in the world as a result of heavily dependent on the oil and gas and others coming from the Hormuz Strait. About 60% of the oil that this region imports come normally from the Hormuz Strait. So in that respect, we think that the report comes at such a good time, because we know that the many countries in the region, like other countries in different parts of the world, are reviewing their energy strategies, policies, priorities, trade partners in the wake of this very crisis. because this crisis, I have the feeling that it is a major wake-up call to Southeast Asian governments for the energy security, economic security, and beyond. So, in that respect, our report highlights the energy scene in the Southeast Asia on a country by country basis and make some observations on the basis of that. And this excellent report, which was prepared under the leadership of our Chief Energy Economics, Tim Good, in cooperation with the countries in the region, their governments, their business and industries, but also our regional cooperation center in Singapore brings a lot of important messages for the policymakers, for the industry in the region. But I will just make 3 points, 3 takeaways from this very report from my perspective. The first one is it shows that the business as usual, sticking the policies that these countries have been pursuing since some time, is not a good one. It is not good for their economy. Huge import bills. This year, for example, we expect the import bills for oil and gas will be around $160 billion, and it will be increasing in the future as a result of increasing oil and gas imports. Not a good news for the economy, not a good news for the energy security, because, as I said, this region has been severely affected of the over-reliance on one single route. This is the second. And third, it is not a good news sticking the business as usual current policies in terms of their environmental outlook, emissions, both the greenhouse gas emissions, but also the local pollution. So this is the one message coming from this very report. The sticking the current policies is not a good one, very clearly. Second, however, the report doesn't only come up with this is not the right policies, the stick to this current policy is not the right one, but it also comes up with some ideas, suggestions, and how to respond to the current crisis and other challenges the region is facing. And even it is about 4 months after we have seen the crisis has started and the response to that. When we look at the early responses and our recommendations, there is a very close parallels between them. One of them is we see several countries are making efforts to put policies in place to have oil stocks in their countries. And we have been working with several governments, with Thailand, with Malaysia, with Philippines and others, how these countries can put oil stocks under the ground for rainy days. This is one area that we are working with these countries, and this is one of the suggestions coming from our report. The second one is that we are seeing renewable energies. There's a huge potential there for renewables, for solar, wind, hydropower, bioenergy. We also see that this report highlights the importance of making more out of renewable energies. And again, after the crisis started, we have seen some countries push the renewable button even stronger than before, especially on solar power, such as Philippines, such as Vietnam, and others. The third area in terms of the responding the current crisis and having a more sustainable energy future, we see the growing appetite for nuclear power. There are countries with plans for nuclear power, and there are countries who are thinking of that. And my colleague Suan Tan sits in Singapore. Prime Minister Lawrence Wang said that they are going to look at the nuclear option. We have received recently the Prime Minister of Thailand to IEA. I know that Mr. Prime Minister is keen to look at the nuclear option closely. Vietnam, again, discussing with the Vietnam government, they are looking at the nuclear option. Both many countries in the region, Indonesia as well, both in terms of the traditional nuclear power plants, but also small modular reactors. Now, dear colleagues, one area that the countries need to put emphasis, it is if we want to have a more sustainable future from an energy security perspective, economic security perspective, is the energy efficiency. The region has a huge potential to improve the energy efficiency with some easy to implement, easy to put together energy efficiency policies. I give you one example, air conditioners. The air conditioner sales in the region is skyrocketing from a very low base, and it will grow even stronger. The report that Mr. Good and his team put together shows that the air condition ownership in the region is still very, very low, despite the need for cooling, growing need for cooling. Just to give you an example, of course, it changes from country to country, but on average, only 30% of the households in the region has an air conditioner, but in some countries it is even lower. In Myanmar, it's 5%, in Indonesia, 18%, it is Philippines also about 20%, but of course Singapore, 80%. But the efficiency point is the following. When you look at the average efficiency of the air conditions in the region, to provide the same comfort, cooling comfort, for a room in Southeast Asia, air conditioners use 2 times more electricity than a similar household uses in Japan. So there's a big room for efficiency improvement for air conditioning, which will be very good for building less power plants. Talking about the power plants and electricity, the report sees a growing role for electrification in the region. The numbers show that the energy demand in the region grows strongly, very strongly, but electricity demand increases 2 times faster than the energy demand in the region. And this would mean building a lot of power plants, grids, and others. In the next 10 years, the amount of power plants this region needs to build is equal to Japan. So in 10 years, we have to build a Japan to the power system in the region, and this will require about $600 billion in 10 years of time, cumulative terms, $600 billion for power plants, for grids, and others. Maybe one last point on the electrification part here is the electric car sales. The region is maybe a surprise to many. It was a surprise to me, to be very frank, until I read the report. The sales of electric cars in the region is very fast, and third, compared to many other regions, the number one is China, followed by Europe, but the third one is Southeast Asia. About 20%, 20% of all the new cars sold in the region is electric. So from that perspective, the electrification, electricity is key here. And of course, a point, a very strong point, comes from our report is how to finance it, this electrification of the economies there in the right way, and what are the ways to make the financing burden a bit less for the countries in Southeast Asia. It comes to the one major project that we think of crucial importance, vital importance for the region is the having a grid, the Asian power grid. The countries in the region have different demand trends. When the demand goes up, when it goes down, it is different from country to country. They have different power mix. For some, hydro is very high. For the others, hydro is low, gas is high. Different power supply mixes, different potential of energy sources in the countries. And when we look at all of them as a region, we see that building grids between the countries would provide enormous economic benefits, cost effective, and makes the electricity much more secure to have an interconnection between the countries. There are some, we know that there are some political barriers because we work on this issue since some time. There are some political barriers, but I personally believe this, the wake-up call with the crisis happened in the crisis caused by the war in Middle East may help to address these political barriers and opens a new and fresh chapter to realize the Asian power grid. And it is an area that our center in Singapore works very hard with the countries in the region. So these are some reflections, some takeaways for me from this very comprehensive report. And with this, maybe I can turn to our Chief Energy Economist, Mr. Tim Gould, who did once again an excellent work with his team to share his thoughts with us. Thank you, Tim. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Executive Director. And indeed, this was work that involved inputs from all across the International Energy Agency, and I'd particularly like to thank our colleagues Jun Takashiro and Jemima Story for helping to bring this all together. But it also involved very close collaboration with Suan Tan and her colleagues in the Regional Cooperation Center in Singapore. And so maybe that's where we'll begin. If I could pass the floor across to Suan to give us a sense of the sort of lived experience of the last few months from an energy perspective as the region has gone through the consequences of the conflict in the Middle East. So maybe, Suan, could you pick up the story for us?
Yes, thank you very much, Tim, and thank you to the Executive Director for those very important opening remarks. I think what we have seen is that the Middle East conflict and the disruption to flows through the Strait of Hormuz has revealed, as the Executive Director has said, the region's very high dependence on the Middle East, especially for oil. And so if we look, this was the situation prior to the conflict. We can see that the region relied quite heavily on imported oil products some of which came directly from the Middle East. In addition, we had some refineries within Southeast Asia that were set up to process crude from the Middle East. Likewise, other refineries in Asia that then exported the products to Southeast Asia. So what this means is overall, almost half of the oil consumed in the region relied directly or indirectly on supplies from the Middle East. So when these supplies of crude and products were disrupted, we saw the major effects across the region in the downstream industries like petrochemical production, as well as really importantly for households and workers who relied on diesel for transport or LPG for cooking. So countries in Southeast Asia were among the first to feel the effects of the crisis, and as the executive director noted, the governments here were also among the first to react. So for example, we had the Philippines declare a state of national energy emergency on the 24th of March. And here from the Regional Cooperation Center in Singapore, we have been in close touch with decision makers across the region over the last 4 months in particular. We've seen in many cases governments put in place measures to reduce demand, for example, by promoting public transport, remote working, and increasing temperature limits for air conditioning. We've also observed price controls and subsidies to protect consumers and particularly impacted groups such as farmers and fishermen, but these obviously come at a cost for governments to implement. And then on the supply side, we've seen efforts to boost domestic fuel output, including initiatives to increase the use of biofuels, as is the case in Indonesia and Vietnam. Countries have also reacted to tight natural gas markets by turning to alternative sources of generation, including by switching to coal. However, our strong impression is that this energy shock is prompting not just the short-term responses, but a deeper reassessment of policy priorities and investment strategies by governments and the broader energy ecosystem in the region. And that's why this new outlook from the IEA is so timely. And I'll now hand back to Tim to explain more.
Thanks very much indeed, Sue-Ann. And this initial reflection is something that the Executive Director mentioned up front, and it helps to explain why we focus so much on Southeast Asia here at the International Energy Agency. As you can see on the screen, second only to India as a source of energy demand growth over the next 10 years. So the choices made in Jakarta, in Singapore, in Kuala Lumpur, in Manila, in Bangkok, they matter not just for the region, but also very much for global trends. We also need to have in mind that this is a very diverse region. There's no single energy pathway that makes sense for everyone. Indonesia, very much the giant in terms of energy consumption, and together with Vietnam has seen the largest growth in demand over the past decade. And total energy demand in the region is now some 40% higher than it was 10 years ago. Region consists of countries at different stages of development, but which are all building out their national infrastructure at pace. And there's a very strong manufacturing story here. Southeast Asia, very well integrated into global value chains and stepping up also in the production of different energy technologies. And these critical minerals that in many cases are inputs to those technologies. So which energy sources have met the region's growing thirst for energy? Over the last 10 years, the main answer to that question has been coal, both for power generation and for industrial use. So 10 years ago, if we just take the power sector as an example, the share of coal in power generation across Southeast Asia was 37%. And in those 10 years, that 37% has gone up by some 10 percentage points. Coal's now around 70% of the generation mix in Indonesia, almost 2/3 in the Philippines, and around half in Malaysia and Vietnam. But that really doesn't tell the whole story. And in recent years, we've seen a greater focus on bringing new technologies into the mix. Last year, we saw record amounts of capital going into renewables, around $17 billion US dollars. And that's one of the reasons why, when we look at the next 10 years in a scenario based on the prevailing policy settings, the largest share of demand growth is met by renewables. But as you can also see on the screen, all the major sources of energy continue to grow. Now that sort of energy trajectory, it really doesn't adequately address yet the sorts of vulnerabilities that have been revealed by the Middle East crisis. And what I wanted to do here is to look at one key indicator of that, and that's the import bills that the region is paying for fossil fuels, notably for oil, and increasingly in the future also for natural gas. So these have been rising in recent years as Southeast Asia became more dependent on imported oil. And as the Executive Director mentioned, we estimate that the Middle East crisis is pushing up that bill this year to around $160 billion. And that's a big strain on the balance of payments and on national budgets, especially when given the price controls and subsidies that Suan mentioned. But I think the key insight here is that what looks like an exceptional year this year is going to become, before too long, a very standard year in terms of that import bill, because those imports continue to rise by around an extra 1 million barrels a day for oil over the next decade. And that, if we look at a scenario that is based just on the policies that are already firmly in place, you know, that dependence on imports is even stronger. So there's a natural focus now, as the Executive Director discussed, to look at different options to deal with this looming vulnerability. I think a first point that we always come back to when discussing energy security vulnerabilities is the importance of diversification. Diversification of suppliers, diversification of routes. We already see for oil discussions with the United States about importing LPG to Indonesia or LNG to Thailand. There are countries that are also looking to Africa as potential sources of supply. But I think countries will also look at what more they can do at home. So are there domestically available sources of energy that they could prioritize over those imports? And when we look at fuels, I mean, that could provide some upside for coal and indeed for biofuels. But the picture is much more mixed when it comes to oil and gas. Some countries will indeed look to encourage additional domestic oil and gas production where it's economically and geologically feasible. But Southeast Asia is a mature producing province, and we project a steady decline in domestic production of both oil and gas. And that's why imports are set to rise dramatically in this kind of scenario. And I think it's worth taking a closer look at the position of gas in Southeast Asia's energy mix, because countries across this region were expected to be a major destination for the wave of LNG that's coming to market over the coming years, mainly from North America and from Qatar. But the world is now facing the second major natural gas supply crisis in the space of 5 years. And that could well affect the readiness of countries in the region to build out new gas infrastructure. We've already seen reports, for example, from Vietnam of one important investor in a new gas-fired power plant looking to switch across to a combination of renewables and batteries. So you could expect to see some adjustment towards domestically available sources for power. That suggests some strong upside for renewables, and that's indeed, renewables grow very strongly in our projections. But as was mentioned, there's also strong interest in the potential for nuclear energy to play a larger role, led by Indonesia and Vietnam. And that doesn't come through before 2035, so it's not visible yet in the chart that you're looking at on the screen. But it's definitely something to watch out for the future. A third potential area where you might expect to see changes in response to today's crisis is the role of electricity. So it's already the case in Southeast Asia that demand for electricity is growing much faster than overall energy demand. And that continues to be the case in all the scenarios that we present in this new outlook. But there could be some additional upside for electricity as a major form of homegrown energy. So this is the picture as things stand for demand growth. Big increase in electricity use for light industrial sectors and for appliances, in particular for air conditioners. The executive director mentioned that today only 30% of households across Southeast Asia have an air conditioner. Well, we anticipate that in 10 years' time, that 30% becomes 60%. And you can imagine that that then is a major additional source of demand, as you see on the screen. But that question of efficiency, the efficiency of those new appliances, becomes a crucial lever that policymakers can push to limit the impacts, particularly on peak demand. There's two other points I wanted to mention on this slide. First, you'll see data centers making an appearance here. We project their annual demand to more than double over the next 5 years. Still a relatively small part of the overall picture, and much of that data center demand is concentrated in a relatively small number of locations, notably in Singapore and Malaysia. But growth in that sector can still create challenges for local grids because these data center facilities tend to concentrate together. And the other one I want to mention is electric mobility, because this is an area where you might expect to see even more substantial growth in the years ahead as a result of today's crisis and the responses to it. When we look at the latest data for car sales, that's for the first quarter of this year, we already see a very significant jump year on year in electric car sales in Southeast Asia compared with 2025. That's led by Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand. There's also huge potential to electrify more of the fleet of 2- and 3-wheelers, which are very popular across the region. And so this is an area where Southeast Asia could make its mark, not just in the vehicle sales, but all along the value chain, because we are starting to see major investments in new manufacturing facilities, both for batteries and for EV manufacturing. And let's not forget that Southeast Asia is also a major player in critical minerals. We are projecting an important increase in nickel, cobalt, rare earth element production over the next 10 years. So as things stand, we are projecting that EVs, together with biofuels, could displace around 1 million barrels a day of oil demand in Southeast Asia by 2035. But there's clearly the possibility to do a lot more. Now, many of the elements that we've talked about so far as plausible responses to today's crisis, renewables, nuclear, efficiency, electrification, are also key building blocks for movement towards the region's long-term targets. So 8 out of the 11 ASEAN member states have announced long-term climate emissions goals, reaching net zero emissions somewhere between 2050 and 2065. And they are typically conditional on enhanced international support. But what we've done in this year's outlook is to include a scenario, an updated pathway, which looks at what would need to happen in order to achieve these targets in full and on time. And one of the key things that would need to happen is that you would need to see a much faster rate of growth in investment in low emissions technologies, a really wide range of low emissions technologies and related infrastructure. But there is a significant return on that investment, not just in terms of emissions, but also in terms of some of the energy security vulnerabilities that we've spoken about in terms of reliance on imported fuels. A final reflection really brings me back to a point that was made very well by the executive director about the importance of regional cooperation. So all of the pathways that we talk about for Southeast Asia look considerably easier to navigate if the region is working closely together. And we highlight several areas where this cooperation can be beneficial, including oil security mechanisms, industrial strategies, but a key one for the future is the ASEAN power grid. It's a long-standing initiative, and you can see on the left-hand side of this slide that we would need a step change in the implementation of cross-border connections and the money that is spent on those cross-border projects in order to get the APG into reality. But there are renewed signs of momentum, and I think the value of this initiative is greater than ever in Southeast Asia as it moves into the age of electricity and reviews its strategic options in response to today's turbulent international energy markets. So I will leave it there. Thanks very much for your attention, and looking forward to hear questions. Back to you, Jethro.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much to all of you for the remarks and the presentation. We now have some time to take questions from the journalists. So we invite those of you journalists who are taking part in this press webinar to send your questions through the Q&A function in the Zoom, if you haven't done so already. And please do mention your media outlet along with your question. We'll take a 2-minute break to give you a chance to enter your questions, and we'll be right back. Thank you. Hello and welcome back. Well, thank you very much to the journalists for the questions so far. We've got quite a few, so we're going to get through as many as we can in the time we have. We'll start with some questions from the region. Bless you. First of all, there's Lianhe Zhaobao, Chua Wei Qian from Lianhe Zhaobao. She asks, would you be able to comment on the energy outlook of Singapore, especially against the current global political uncertainty? What's the biggest opportunity and challenge, and what role does the IEA Regional Cooperation Centre in Singapore continue to play? And then from Reuters, we have Sudarshan Varadhan asking, what is your estimate of gas share in power generation in 2025? And how much do you expect it to increase to by 2035? And then noting or saying, given the comments on anxiety around LNG dependence, given the recent geopolitical shocks and policy measures to boost renewables, is that starting to translate into long-term investment in LNG infrastructure in the region? Why or why not? And then one follow-up, is this the 2015 solar moment for batteries? And are you seeing evidence of rapid adoption or at least policy cues? And then a question from Philip Chaffee from Energy Intelligence on EVs that Tim talked a bit about in the presentation. Do you expect the boost to EV demand in Southeast Asia might compensate for the diminished EV demand we're seeing in places like the United States? So maybe we'll take, that's already a good initial batch of questions. Perhaps we can go to Suern first of all on the question on Singapore in terms of what's the energy outlook for Singapore, biggest opportunity and challenge, and the role of the Regional Cooperation Centre. Suern.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for that excellent question. So if we look at Singapore, currently more than 95% of Singapore's power is generated from gas, but we've seen the Singapore government announce that it has secured sufficient LNG and gas supply for the rest of the year, so that's been managed. We've also got Singapore as one of the major refining hubs for the region, and around half of its crude imports have come from the Middle East. And that is also one of note. And finally, Singapore is also the world's largest international bunkering hub. So it's been looking at various opportunities to sort of diversify how it manages its maritime fuel. I think what we have seen in terms of the opportunities and challenges is the Singapore government proactively working to diversify its energy supply, and that's in two main ways. So firstly, it set a target to import 6 gigawatts of low carbon electricity by 2035. And that set a really nice, clear demand signal for the region. And it's then leading under the ASEAN banner also a lot of the work streams to progress the implementation of the ASEAN power grid, which both the ED and team have spoken about. So I think that that's been a really important action to diversify its supply. And then finally, as mentioned by the Executive Director, Prime Minister Wong announced last month that starting next year, Singapore will now undertake an assessment to make an informed decision on the potential deployment of advanced nuclear energy here. So that's been another attempt to diversify. And then in terms of what the IEA is doing in the center here, we're working to support the Singapore government, particularly as it comes into its ASEAN chairmanship next year. Along as well as, of course, with the other ASEAN member states as they try to ensure their energy security in an affordable and sustainable way. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Suern. And then we had the question on gas's share of power demand in, this year and the outlook there, and then EVs as well. Any thoughts on those, Tim?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. So the gas question is an interesting one. So the share of gas-fired generation in the regional electricity mix has actually come down quite substantially over the last 10 years. So back in 2015, it was slightly above 40%. But since then, the output from the region's gas-fired power plants has essentially flatlined. And in the context of a rapidly expanding electricity system, that means that the share of gas in the total mix has come down from slightly above 40% to just around 25, 26% today. Now, the increase in gas-fired power that we anticipate is around a 60% increase over the period to 2035, which would take it up to around 600 terawatt hours by the middle of that decade. And that's enough to keep it sort of a hold on that sort of quarter share in the regional power generation mix. But I think the question rightly points out that it's quite a different perspective having a quarter share in the generation mix if that gas is produced domestically versus an increasing reliance on imported LNG. And that's just purely from an economic perspective, let alone some of the sort of gas security and broader energy security factors that are now in play. So I think there is an open question about how ready the region will be to invest heavily in new gas infrastructure over the next 10 years. You know, there will undoubtedly be an opportunity there with all of the LNG that is still scheduled to come to market from the Middle East, but particularly from North America. But whether the infrastructure investments will be put in place to receive that gas, so that consumers in Southeast Asia can really see what we still believe will be relatively attractive prices for LNG, I think is an open question. One final distinction to be made. So in an environment where domestic gas production is falling, there's clearly an opportunity for imported LNG to, in a sense, fill in those gaps left by those declines. But 2/3 of the gas that we anticipate that is used over the next 10 years would require some investment in new infrastructure. So there's a bit of a distinction to be made there. On the EV question, yes, there is a sense that emerging developing economies outside China, sales are picking up in some of those regions, and I think Southeast Asia is a particularly good example. And at global level, what we found in last year's World Energy Outlook is that does offset to a degree reduced expectations for EV sales in the United States.
Thanks a lot, Tim. And of course, we released our global electric vehicle outlook just last month, so that also can provide a pretty good global perspective on these different trends, if you'd like to take a look at that. So just also a couple more questions, I think, focused on the power sector. One from Sharanya Pillai in the Business Times in Singapore. On the $27 billion needed for Southeast Asia's connections, where do you see funding coming from? Primarily the public or the private sector? And what can be done to stimulate funding? And then there are a couple of questions on power generation. Tom Pepper from Energy Intelligence, what are the main types of renewable investment the IEA expects to see in Southeast Asia over the next 10 years? And Alok Gupta, a freelance journalist, asking how will energy production in Southeast Asia pan out in the coming years, taking into account the turmoil caused by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz? Will it be more nuclear power or more renewable energy? So, Tim, any thoughts on where the growth in power generation is going to come from? Well, capacity and generation is going to come from in the coming years.
You know, for us, our analysis suggests that renewables do well. Over a slightly longer perspective, nuclear clearly has some important potential. But given the increase in the region's electricity needs, I think pretty much everything needs to pick up in a scenario that's based on today's policy settings. There was a question too about the way that you finance the expansion of grids. Now, up until now, most of those cross-border projects have in fact been financed as two separate projects, largely on the balance sheet of the respective utilities on either side of the border. That would need to change to generate the sorts of expansion in interconnections that is foreseen in the ASEAN Power Grid project. So you would need to have a more integrated view of how these projects are put together, and based on a degree of harmonization and trading conditions across borders. And you would need to be bringing in other sorts of finance. So there would undoubtedly continue to be a strong role for public sorts of finance. But that would be moving more towards a catalytic role than to bring in some private funding as well. And that's particularly if you think about the need for subsea cable projects and so on. That's really the model that we're looking to underpin that expansion in regional electricity trade.
Very good. Thank you, Tim. And so, of course, there's been quite a few references to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, to the energy crisis, and obviously there's a lot happening on that front this week. Some major developments. And we do have some questions on that, so I think we'll take some of those questions now. They do go a bit broader than the Southeast Asia outlook, but obviously there's implications for Southeast Asia and the world. So we have from Dizite, Mali's Ukan, to Dr. Birol saying you've spoken of the biggest energy crisis from the start of the Iran war. Now that the situation in the Strait of Hormuz appears to be easing, do you believe we will return to a certain normality in the energy markets, or will there be global, structural, and lasting changes? We also have a question from Jonathan Josephs of the BBC, noting that we've seen strains across Southeast Asia, but when you look at things globally, what is your biggest concern about the state of global energy markets right now? Oil prices have fallen, but stockpiles have been depleted, production infrastructure destroyed, and it still isn't entirely clear when the Strait of Hormuz will reopen. And then also from Agence France Presse, Nathalie Alonso asks, what will be the consequences of the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz on global oil and gas trade in terms of volumes and prices? If the Strait of Hormuz is fully reopened, do you consider that the worst energy crisis in history will be behind us? So quite a lot of ground covered there. I'm not sure you can answer all of those in the time we have left, but at least give your thoughts on the implications of this agreement that's been announced and what could come next.
Thank you, Jetro. Thank you for these questions. So we had, in fact, the world had a very good news that there is a agreement announcement between the government of United States and that of Iran, that there are steps towards peace, and we warmly welcome this announcement, and I very much hope that this will lead to a lasting peace in the region. It is a great news for on a human level across the Middle East, but also very good news in terms of the global economy and energy system. At the IES, since the crisis has started almost 4 months now, even though we made a lot of efforts in terms of, for example, releasing historical level of oil stocks to the markets, and advising many countries what kind of policies they can put in place to save energy, to increase their production, and many other countries, institutions put efforts in place to address this crisis. We always said, single most important solution to this problem is the fully and unconditionally opening up of Strait of Hormuz to shipping. And I very much hope that these efforts among the countries will lead to fully and unconditionally opening of Strait of Hormuz as soon as possible, so that we see that the oil and gas starts to flow again to Southeast Asia, Asia, and beyond. This will give a comfort to the markets. And as we always do, we are going to monitor the situation on almost every day, every hour here. And in fact, tomorrow we are coming up with our monthly oil market report, where we are going to share how we see the markets in the next weeks, months to come. And this is even an Herculean job to see as the things change all the time. Having said that, even though the prices come to the level of 27th of February or beyond, or even earlier, if we come to the price levels that the world was having before the crisis, I can tell you that this crisis sent shock waves to the global energy sector. And this crisis, which we call the largest energy crisis in the history, will lead, if it, I should say, does lead many countries, many governments reviewing their energy policies, strategies, options, partners, and others. Decisions that the countries will take now will not only look at what is the most economic option for my country, but maybe the determining factor will be what is the most secure option for my country, for my economy, for my customer, for my population. So therefore, the issue of trust appears as a major factor in the energy world now, and this has changed substantially after the 28th of February, and we will see this will play an important role in the international energy trade, in the long-term contracts, in terms of joint ventures and others. Diversification will be more important. Predictability will be more important. Trust will be more important. And whatever the prices are, it is not going to change this new chapter in the global energy sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birol. I think that's a pretty strong note to end on, and that's all we have time for. We've gone quite a bit over time. We have a lot of questions, more than we can answer, unfortunately. So if for those of you journalists whose questions didn't get answered or have other questions, please do reach out to the press office, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Otherwise, I'd just like to say a big thank you to Dr. Birol, to Tim, to Sue-Ann. Thank you to the journalists for your questions, and thank you to everyone following this event online for your interest in our work. A reminder that the full Southeast Asia Energy Outlook 2026 is available, freely available on our website. Do please take a look. Thank you very much, and goodbye.